We people who are dark and blue, don't let us hang around that and let what others say come true. We're just good enough. They all forgive. A boy should know no shit is just. Welcome everyone to Darker Than Blue. It is Friday, January 16th at 5 p.m. And that must mean I am Jackie Lukeman. And yes, this is Darker Than Blue, the show where we talk about politics for the people who are darker than blue. Hey, y'all. So glad to see you. So glad that you have joined me today. And there is a lot to talk about because, oh my goodness, can we just get down to brass tacks right now and talk about slave patrols, police, and ICE? Because the historic political and ideological lineage of bipartisan population control between these three systems, very, very important for us to get clear because of what is going on in Minneapolis, in Texas, in New Orleans, and other cities where the Trump regime is horrifying and evil, and certainly must be stopped. What they're doing right now in these cities across the country with ICE and the police, the people in the streets trying to disrupt these kidnappings and protect people from violent abuse and assault and even shootings, maimings, and murders committed by these armed and masked goon squad members is fantastic to see. I'm happy to see it. The organizing resources and protection, among people who have no experience with organizing, but they're talking to their neighbors, they're making plans, they're carrying out ways to protect each other, to alert each other, to communicate with each other about what's going on in their communities. Fantastic. I'm happy to see it. The building out of communications and support networks, absolutely necessary in this fight that we have before us, that we have had before us since this place began. It is wonderful to see all of this organizing and activity and solidarity among the people in the communities. And I really hope that when this is over, and y'all, folks, please hear me, it will be over at some point. It will be. How? That's the question. None of us know that, but it will be over at some point because everything ends, and empires especially do fall. And we know that this empire is collapsing. That's why all this stuff is happening. This empire is crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance, as every other empire before it has crumbled. So it's fantastic to see the people in the streets, in the communities coming together, organizing, talking to each other. And I hope that when this is over, the people do not stop improving, perfecting, and expanding these efforts toward destroying this evil capitalist system on which all of this rests. Because I feel like everything marginalized, oppressed, colonized people in the US, us Africans and indigenous and black and brown immigrants, as well as queer, trans, and disabled people. We've been telling the rest of the country about how deeply and foundationally unjust and unequal this society and its laws have always been toward us. And now I think everything that is going on in this country is exposing the truth of what we have been saying all this time. Now, we talk about this history, friends. Well, I talk about this history because I am trying to get people to understand that removing the people or the person or the persons who are currently carrying out the abuses, that's not going to stop the abuses from being committed. I know that people think that you get rid of Trump, everything will be fine. Well, I don't think that's true. And I think we all know that's true because the infrastructure and ideology that facilitate today's abuses didn't begin with today's demagogues or their current evil policies. If we don't get rid of the policies and everyone who supports them and always has, someone else will just come along and continue them as they have done up to this point. And we cannot know what policies need to be eradicated if we don't know what policies are being used to do what we see now, how they facilitate the abuses, and everything they're connected to that created the environment we're all suffocating in now. When we raise the history of our oppression and the bipartisan nature of Democrats and Republicans agreeing to oppress us, we have done this to warn you that if you accept what's done to us, then it's just a matter of time and artificially deteriorating economic and social conditions that bring the terror that we have lived through down your street, to your door, used against you. We did not want this to happen to anyone else. That's why we kept telling you that you better do something about what these folks in both parties and all of the capitalists have been doing to us and continue to do to us if you don't want it to happen to you. But here we are. So let's be clear that the history of this country informs the present abominations in ways that too many have been willing to ignore, dismiss, or try to silence the discussion of, if not outright lie about. Regardless of the efforts to disconnect the present from the past, there is a profound, significant, and thoroughly documented historical and ideological connection linking the institution of slave patrols, the development of modern police, and the contemporary operations of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. This continuity is not accidental. It's not a coincidence. It's not a bug. It's a feature of the system. It is rooted in centuries long history of social control in this country, the maintenance of racial hierarchy, and the strategic enforcement of laws specifically designed to target and subjugate marginalized groups. So, folks, let's start with the foundation, slave patrols, and the genesis of U.S. law enforcement. In the American South, particularly from the 17th through the mid 19th centuries, slave patrols were the earliest and often the only formalized system of law enforcement in the South. Their existence was intrinsically, inextricably, you don't have one without the other, tied to the chattel slavery economic model. Their core mandate and tactics in being a mechanism for control in the slave system in the US included the enforcement of codes. Slave patrols vigilantly enforced detailed legal statuses, otherwise known as slave codes, that severely restricted the autonomy, movement, assembly, and literacy of enslaved people. These laws, slave codes, codified the dehumanization of African people and their descendants who were enslaved, and a constant fear of organized insurrection among the enslaved because of that repression is also what the slave patrols were responsible for, the prevention of rebellion. Right, this fear of rebellion among the enslaved drove the slave patrols aggressive surveillance and preemptive use of violence to suppress potential uprisings. Sound familiar? Today's talk of predictive crime modeling, like the movie, what was it called? Minority Report. I can't stand Tom Cruise, but I like that movie because I understood that that movie was talking about something that had already happened in the past, and the science fiction aspect of it was just focusing on the technology that was used. But the idea of preemptive policing, punishing people for crimes that the state thinks they are going to commit. That ain't new. That's not science fiction. It is historical fact. The only difference is, fancy technologies weren't used then. It was just, racial hatred. That's it. Today's talk of predictive crime modeling really is nothing more than an extension of slave patrols, preventative brutality to stop suspected slave rebellions, based on not a doggone thing other than their fear and hatred. But they were not and never could be successful in beating the thirst for freedom out of the Africans and their descendants, us, our ancestors, no matter how brutal they were. But the slave patrols were also tasked with the relentless pursuit, capture, and brutal return of escaped enslaved individuals, a function that necessitated widespread judicial jurisdiction and cooperation with civilian slave catchers and local legislations, right? Or legislatures. Due to the economic incentive attached to returning escapees, bounty hunting, sometimes free Black people were captured by slave patrols and civilian slave bounty hunters and sold back into slavery. And then slave patrols fundamentally used systemic brutality, intimidation, and terror to uphold the strict racial hierarchy of the slave society. This was done not just because the slave patrollers hated Black people. This was not done because of anti-Blackness. This was done to uphold the economic and social hierarchy, which kept enslaved people and their descendants on the absolute bottom of both the economic and the social hierarchy, for the ideological benefit of the slave owning class and for their material benefit as well. But also, this social hierarchy benefited Northern industrialists, and it largely benefited a racially segregated U.S. society as a whole, not just in the South. So, this is the foundation for slave patrols, both the formal slave patrols hired and formed by plantation owners through their militias, right? And the standalone institution of slave patrols that a lot of southern states had, and the civilian slave patrols who were paid in bounties. That this is the system that transitioned into formal policing. The Civil War and the subsequent abolition of slavery, at least on paper, led to the formal disbanding of slave patrols, but their functions and personnel didn't just disappear. They evolved, and very quickly were integrated into the emerging structures of formal policing post Civil War, especially across the former Confederacy. The spirit of slave patrols as population control was immediately codified through new legislation like the Black Codes and later Jim Crow laws. So there were new laws with the same old intent that were enforced through now this new policing apparatus. These new laws, Black Codes and Jim Crow laws, were explicitly designed to substitute legal slavery with new forms of racialized control over Black labor movement and their citizenship rights, which were new at the time. These early police forces, particularly in the South, often recruited the former slave patrol members all across the board and adopted their tactics, shifting the focus of the new police forces from protecting and serving the population to enforcing racial segregation, suppressing newly freed Black communities, and brutally managing labor, literally brutally beating Black people out of competing for labor with white workers. A notorious example of this is the implementation and the use of vagrancy laws to arrest particularly Black people, formerly enslaved people who were now free, for being unemployed or unhoused, to funnel them into the exploitative convict leasing system. Remember that vagrancy and loitering were not crimes before the end of the Civil War. They were made crimes when millions of Africans and their descendants who were no longer legally enslaved were therefore no longer forced to work for free and forced to live on the plantations of and take care of the land of and the property of slave owners and their property and for their profit. Black codes and Jim Crow made the formerly enslaved being free a crime. So the system that profited off their enslavement could still enslave them in another way to continue those profits from their continued forced labor. Then the primary enduring function of US policing is the social control over racially defined populations. That's the foundation of US policing. The institution's historical mandate was never purely about public safety for all citizens. For the landowning class, yeah, sure. For the rich, but the continuity of function between slave patrols and policing is the protection of property and economic interests of the rich. The core historical directive of policing has consistently been defense of capital, land, and economic status of the rich, not the universal protection and service of the community or the maintenance of impartial law and order. That's not what police exist to do. That's never been what policing has existed to do in this country. It is the protection of profit and property that has driven police action throughout history, not protecting and serving the people, the community, and certainly not stopping crime. Because the police and slave catchers before them protected the entities that exploited and hurt vulnerable people for profit so they could continue their crimes against humanity to continue and increase their profits from it. Policing has systematically targeted, managed, and surveilled communities of color through tactics like racial profiling, the application of broken windows policing theory that led to things like stop and frisk, and the disproportionate use of excessive force. These practices remain the spatial and social segregation, and they keep it initially enforced by the earlier structures of slave patrols and plantation militias. But then there is the legal and judicial aspect of this system and ideology, because landmark legal decisions like the Dred Scott decision, which denied Black people citizenship, and then Plessy v. Ferguson, which implemented separate but equal in public accommodation and throughout US institutions, legally reinforced the societal view that Black people were not entitled to full rights. And by extension, it was Black people, Indigenous people, and every other non European group of immigrants that came to this country. A deeply embedded mindset that structured and legitimized the behavior of police officers for generations, even up until today. Even after the civil rights movement, the documented disparities in policing, the phenomenon of mass incarceration, and ongoing police violence facilitated by stop and frisk, racial profiling, over policing of poor and racialized communities are symbols of a continuation of this system of racial and social control through quote unquote law enforcement established in this country. And now we get to the modern apparatus of this triple evil based system: slave patrols, policing, and ICE. We get to ICE. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, established in 2003 under the Department of Homeland Security, is the federal agency responsible for enforcing immigration law. Its contemporary practices like mass detentions, aggressive deportations, family separations have drawn forceful and kind of obvious historical comparisons to the operations of slave patrols and other historical modes of racial control. And there are direct historical and operational parallels between slave patrols, early policing, and ICE today through the targeting of marginalized groups. Just as slave patrols focused overwhelmingly on enslaved Black people, and Jim Crow era police focused on Black communities, but they were not afraid to string up white folks who were in solidarity with us, to understand that. Today's ICE operations disproportionately target specific racial and ethnic groups like Latino people. Now they're targeting Hmong people, immigrants, obviously Haitians, Sudanese, Somalians, anybody who's not white presenting. And if you get in their way and you're white presenting, they'll snatch you up too or shoot you in the face. Then slave patrols were the physical arm enforcing the rigid boundaries between slave and free. In a similar way, ICE enforces the boundaries of citizenship, enforcing the boundary or upholding the boundary between citizen and non-citizen, even as they are showing in their enforcement that there is no boundary between citizen and non-citizen as far as they're concerned, because they are snatching up and assaulting and maiming and killing citizen and non-citizen alike. Both functions are central to defining who belongs and who does not, often with deep racialized outcomes that primarily affect people of color, but today extends to expressing politicized outcomes, with people expressing dissent or resistance to these policies among the targets. Not at all unlike the Red Scare anti-communist terrorism that went on in this country during the World War II era and later. But then all three systems rely on pervasive surveillance, the threat or reality of incarceration, detention, or jail or prison, and the threat of family destruction through the sale of enslaved people or through deportation as central mechanisms to compel compliance and maintain the established racial, social, economic, political hierarchy. And some of ICE's aggressive tactics, like large scale workplace raids and the historical practice of apprehending individuals during routine traffic stops or localized arrests, strongly mirror the manhunt methods used by slave patrols to search for and apprehend escaped enslaved people. You see how ICE is chasing people down, tackling them, dragging them along the ground, boxing their cars in, dragging people out of stores, going to schools, kidnapping people in schools, or literally snatching people off the street. That's slave catcher behavior. And I don't know, I don't believe that y'all didn't see that when you saw it at first. You knew what it was. Some of you just didn't want to admit that's what it was. But we must. Because if we are going to eradicate the scourge from our society and build something better, we have to be honest about what it is we are fighting. We have to be honest about what and who it is that is at war with us. Can't win if we don't know who we're fighting. So these systems are not only connected historically, they're also connected through a continuation of that historic racist ideology upheld in current law and its enforcement. The current enforcement structure unifies local police and federal immigration agencies, mirroring historical patterns of surveillance and control over racialized groups. This is not new. Again, the only thing that is new is the technology and probably the uniforms the hardware, because this fusion that we see now of the police working with ICE, this stems from policies like the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, the 287G agreements, and something called some secure communities. Now, collectively, these modern measures significantly broaden the scope of deportation and monitoring by explicitly linking local policing to federal immigration enforcement. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, or IRCA, was landmark U.S. legislation that sought to control illegal immigration by imposing employer sanctions, fines, and penalties for companies that hire unauthorized workers, increasing border enforcement and offering legalization or amnesty to undocumented immigrants who arrived before 1982. Plus, it provided for special provisions for farm workers to protect them, right? To allow them to continue to work here in this country. It required employers to verify worker status using the I-9 form, making it a significant shift towards employer responsibility. But its complex design, and it really wasn't its complex design. It was that the capitalists were like, no, it's too hard for us to make money off this people. Let's stop doing this. But the key provisions of IRCA that make it one of the reasons people remember it is the sanctions against employers for knowingly hiring, recruiting, or referring for a fee people who are unauthorized to work in the U.S. and requiring the verification of worker identities and eligibility through using the I-9 form, and the amnesty program, the legalization program that granted legal status, permanent residency to undocumented immigrants who had resided continuously in the U.S. since January 1982, and to provide specific protections for agricultural workers. And the legislation even included an anti discrimination clause that was supposed to prevent discrimination against unauthorized workers based on their national origin or citizenship status. The IRCA was the most significant immigration reform in this country in decades, establishing employer responsibility for verifying employment eligibility, and the pathway to citizenship provided through the legislation was groundbreaking. Now, the US government did not stop its illegal and immoral interference in the countries that people immigrate from, which is why people immigrate from their home countries in the first place. U.S. foreign policy in the global south has destabilized multiple countries, propping up actual dictators who steal from the people, exploit their labor, carry out violent repression against opposition, and destabilize the economy and society with austerity policies that favor the wealthy landowning few and further impoverish the landless working class and poor populations. But this immigration policy from 1986 seemed to be more humane than what we have even now, even though the US was actively destabilizing Nicaragua, El Salvador, Grenada, Honduras, and others between 1981 and 1986. These interventions in Latin American countries didn't contribute to, caused the immigration of their besieged populations to the US. So, if US politicians were really serious about solving illegal immigration, they would simply stop illegal interference in other countries. But the capitalist dictators in the US and their European friends can't steal and profit from other people's resources if they mind their own business. Now, can they? No, they can't, so they won't. But did you know that it was Republican racist President Ronald Reagan who signed the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act into law? It's true. Racist Ronnie was a capitalist dictator to his core and had no problem with racially profiling dark people. You know, the whole welfare queen, that was very racist, yes. But his commitment to maintaining the American standard of capitalist dominance, that he and his friends benefited from drove him to provide some level of protection to the class of exploited immigrants that this government's foreign policy drove to the US border, that his administration's policy had a big old hand in driving to the US border. Look up Ronald Reagan and Nicaragua. Uh-huh. Today's Trump-Publican Party would never agree to such legislation because it isn't fascist enough, quite honest. But you know those immigration policy, you know whose immigration policy was more restrictive and more in line with what today's Republican Party would love than Ronald Reagan's? Bill Clinton's immigration policy. Yep. We're going to talk a little bit more about that on the other side of this station break because it is 30 minutes past the hour and you know what time it is. It is time for a WPFW station break. So, engineer extraordinaire, what do you have on tap for the people today?
On Monday, January 19th, 9 a.m. until midnight, WPFW presents Injustice Anywhere, honoring the Pan-Africanists, MLK, and Haiti, the first sovereign Black republic. From 9 a.m. until noon, we examine the Pan-Africanist legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. From noon until midnight, we center Haiti, her history, triumphs, troubles, and culture. That's Injustice Anywhere, honoring the Pan-Africanists, MLK, and Haiti, the first sovereign Black republic. Monday, January 19th, 9 a.m. until midnight. WPFW, Building a Better World, one broadcast at a time.
Thank you so much. And I think it is incredibly timely that we're having this conversation about what led to the situation that we are living through now with the ICE raids. And honestly, I got to tell you, these ICE raids have gotten me thinking a whole lot about the Reconstruction era and the fascist coup in this country about of the Reconstruction governments. We talked about that a little bit, excuse me, last week. And I at first I didn't understand why, but no, now I absolutely get that what we're seeing today is the extension of the redemption period after Reconstruction. This is like what the Trump administration is doing now is what the Daughters of the Confederacy and their pushing of the lost cause mythology. This is this is what they wanted to do throughout the entire country to redeem America as a white nation. You gotta look up the history because if you don't believe that that's what this is, you don't know the history. Which is, of course, why I talk about history all the time because we can't get to justice and freedom and real liberation if we don't know who is oppressing us, why, and how, and for how long. Right? So let's get back to this legislation because while President Reagan's 1986 amnesty law is remembered, and the amnesty provision is the reason why people remember it, because who would have thought that racist Reagan would have been this reasonable? But Bill Clinton's 1996 Illegal Immigration and Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, or IRA as it's called, fundamentally reshaped U.S. immigration enforcement, creating the massive deportation system that exists and is being deployed today. Unlike Clinton's welfare and crime bills, and we've talked about those a little bit, but you need to go back and look at what Bill Clinton did to working class poor and racialized people in this country through his welfare reform and the crime bills and the Telecommunication Act. We've talked about it a little bit, but maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more as the months go on through this year. But his immigration legislation, IRA, has not been widely relitigated in the public. And the few attempts to revise or replace the bill among legislators have quietly disappeared because Democrats are really just not about that equality, justice, and truth and righteousness life. I'm just going to say it because there's no use in continuing to be coy about it. Democrats are not our friends. Ira, reviled by most immigration experts, made more people deportable and fewer people eligible for legal status. It dramatically expanded the types of crimes for which legal immigrants, including green card holders, could be deported, applying these changes retroactively. This stripped many longtime residents of their right to appear before a judge, fast tracking them to deportation. Clinton did that, not Reagan. The 1996 law also made it easier to deport others, like people apprehended near the border, and reduce the discretion of immigration judges and executive branch, leading to, guess what? A rise in deportations. Clinton's IRA legislation expanded the type of crimes even legal immigrants could be deported for. Before 1996, deportation was primarily for serious felonies like murder and rape, and you had to be convicted of those felonies. Clinton's legislation added 17 aggravated felonies, including theft, counterfeiting, and receiving stolen property with a 5-year sentence. The IRA then lowered the required sentence for theft and forgery to 1 year, including probation. So you could be deported if you got convicted of theft and forgery and were sentenced to just 1 year. You were getting deported. And the year could include a year of probation. Deported. These changes significantly increased the number of immigrants, documented or not, who were eligible for removal. Now we go to Trump's first administration. His immigration executive orders didn't create these things. These things already existed because of Bill Clinton's legislation. So Trump's first administration's executive orders on immigration further expanded what was already there, established by Clinton, by targeting undocumented immigrants merely charged with any offense. That is really the only thing Trump added, did differently, did extra in his first administration in regard to immigration. He just issued an executive order that said, no, we're going to deport everybody who's charged, whether they have actually been convicted, whether they've actually seen, had their day in court or not. If you're arrested for an offense, out. And we're going to get to how that happens. Because if somebody is arrested for an offense, don't the police have to be involved? Yes, they do. And we're going to get to that. But along with broadening the definition of deportable crimes, Clinton's 1996 Act called for the mandatory detention of immigrants convicted of aggravated felonies pending their removal. As a result, the average daily number of immigrants held in detention centers skyrocketed from 6,785 in 1994, I cannot believe this number, to 19,458 by the time Clinton left office. This legislation was signed into law in 1996. Many were held in private for-profit facilities. Now we got to have a little conversation about that, because the for-profit private facilities that profited enormously from the continued IRA enforcement and expansion under Obama and Trump. Public Citizen, the publication, reported back in 2019 that federal immigration and corrections policies in the Trump and Obama administrations have resulted in a windfall for private government contractors. 10 large contracting firms working for 5 federal agencies. This was from 2019 now. Implementing federal immigrations, corrections, and detention policies received, get ready, y'all, $2.32 billion with a B in federal contract revenue in 2018, up 17% from nearly $2 billion at the start of Donald Trump's first term, and more than double the 942 million those same companies received in 2013. Those contracting firms run detention facilities and prisons. They transport detained migrants by plane. We talked about those planes in a couple of shows ago last year. Provide security guards and build technological systems for U.S. immigration and corrections agencies, among other activities. Now, these estimates were from 2019. You know that amount of money has probably tripled at this point. So now we're probably talking about close to $6 billion or more. Going to have to go look up and see if anybody has done a current analysis of the amount of money that's being spent on these private contractors that have these government contracts to torture, abuse, rape, and murder immigrants. Public Citizen also analyzed the 10 largest recipients of federal contracts from 5 agencies and offices involved in corrections and immigrant detention in 2018 and compared those figures to the amount of federal contract revenue received by the same companies over the last decade. Those 5 agencies analyzed are ICE, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, the Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Marshal Service, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The analysis was not limited to contracts for immigration and correction functions. It found that the largest contractors for these agencies typically were involved in immigration and corrections, including operation of prisons and migrant detention facilities, as well as providing all manner of services to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So even if an agency wasn't an agency that was supposed to be focused on immigration, somehow they got involved in immigration. The analysis also shows that this spending began rising during President Barack Obama's second term, coinciding with a surge in migrants from Central America. Under Trump, spending ramped up even more as federal government pressed ahead with sweeping efforts to constrain the flow of immigration to the United States. And again, ain't nobody stopped bombing Central American countries, but And of course, the efforts to demonize immigrants have outraged many Americans, but they've also benefited private contracting firms really, really exponentially, especially the 2 largest private prison companies. You know the name of one of them, starts with a core. Numerous reports and investigations of private prisons and detention centers over many years have documented evidence and allegations of violence, substandard medical care, deaths and suicides, sexual abuse, and exploitative labor practices. But to be clear, it was not crime committed by immigrants that Clinton was targeting. He was helping his friends in the private prison corporations make their money, and you know he and his wife got their cut, as did Democrats and Republicans before and after Clinton. Starting at about 40-ish years ago, the U.S. government began to delegate to private corporations the power to operate federal prisons and immigrant detention facilities. In early 1980s, under the Reagan administration, the Immigration and Nationalization Service, INS, the predecessor of ICE, was among the first federal agencies to contract with for-profit corporations to run detention facilities. Advocates of private contractors claimed that they could save taxpayer money while relieving prison overcrowding. But of course, that's not what happened, and we know that's not what happened. The private prison industry has just kept growing through both Democrat and Republican administrations, despite all of the well-documented abuses, and thrived as border crossings have surged over the past 15 years. Because U.S. imperialism, as you are also now seeing, has not only never stopped, but it has just gotten on steroids. The average daily population of detained people held in ICE and INS facilities in this country has grown from about 20,000 in 2000 to nearly 40,000 by the end of President Obama's term. And don't ask me how many people are being detained now, because we can't keep up with the number of people who are being kidnapped every minute of every day in the cities that I mentioned at the top of this show. And of course, these companies and many more, and the politicians and capitalist dictators behind and invested in them, are making a killing out here, kidnapping and killing people on the streets of the US now to fill those beds in those detention facilities. Furthermore, Clinton's legislation, IRA, severely restricted pathways to legal status for authorized immigrants. It just made it harder for people, even people who were documented, to avoid deportation. So the long-term effect of IRA, signed into law under Bill Clinton, was a shift from deportation in this country being rare, because it was rare at one time, to a common, daily, everyday, this is just what we're going to do occurrence, while the same government is bombing the heck out of the countries people are immigrating from, and acting as if they don't know why all these people are coming to the US border. They're lying to you from top to bottom. Combined with increased border spending and post 9/11 reorganization into the Department of Homeland Security, IRA's legal framework built a formidable machinery that increased annual deportations from around 70,000 in 1996 to 400,000 during the Obama administration. Then there are other programs like the 287G program, which the first Trump regime's immigration executive order called for a rapid expansion of the program, which meant that Trump didn't create it. The program was already there because it was a part of the IRA legislation. What is it? The 287G program of the Immigration and Nationality Act became law as part of IRA in 1986. The 287G program has state and local law enforcement officers collaborate with the federal government to enforce federal immigration laws. In the past, the 287G program had been too costly for a lot of local police departments, but it has historically targeted individuals with little or no criminal history. And it has really obviously done a horrible thing toward immigrant communities. But it's also just made the police look like the jackbooted thugs that they've always been, right? But it was in place as part of the original Clinton era IRA legislation. So this partnership between U.S. ICE and the 287G program and state and local agencies turns local police into ICE agents, authorizing selected officers to identify, arrest, and process certain people for immigration enforcement and ultimately deportation. Now, the ACLU has challenged the 287G program for years, and these programs have been redeployed under this new Trump administration, obviously, but they were already in place. And under the Obama administration, because of the cost to local police officers, only about 37 police, or 32, 37 participating state and local law enforcement agencies participated in the 287G program under the Obama administration. But that leapt to 152 law enforcement agencies in Trump's first term. And then the administration removed guardrails on the program, like expiration dates for participation agreements, right? But then Joe Biden comes into office, and if you think he outlawed that law, I don't know what to tell you, because he left the program, Joe Biden did, left the program intact, including those unexpired 152 agreements with those local law enforcement agencies. And he refused, Biden did, to kick out participating law enforcement agencies that had records of racial profiling and anti immigrant abuse, despite demands from the ACLU and grassroots organizations for him to do that. Biden refused to eliminate those police agencies that kicked Black folks and immigrants folks behind. So now, in the second Trump administration, the number of local agencies opting to act as deportation force multipliers has grown by 600%. The program 287G has encroached into states that until now had few or no participating agencies like Iowa, Maine, New Mexico, Utah, West Virginia. So not only are the so-called ICE agents kidnapping and murdering people, and these people are a lot of white nationalist militia members from the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, and so on, but they could also very well be members of local police departments from various states. We have no way to really know, do we, with those masks and the lack of identification, which is supposed to be illegal for the police to do, but that's not how the Klan rolls, see? Then there's this thing called Secure Communities Program, which was initiated under President George Bush in 2008 and significantly underspanded under guess who? Everybody's favorite Black president, Barack Obama. The Secure Communities Program required law enforcement agencies to submit fingerprint records to ICE. ICE could then issue orders to local law enforcement to hold individuals suspected of immigration violations until they can be transferred into ICE custody. Most often, this resulted in people held by local police beyond what's allowed by a judicial warrant, which is 48 hours. When localities in San Francisco and Santa Clara, California, Arlington, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. tried to opt out of the Safer Communities program, ICE entertained their requests for months before ultimately revealing, because they were made to reveal, that they never intended to give states the option to opt out of the program. In response, multiple local jurisdictions, including Cook County, Illinois, and Washington, D.C., passed legislation to limit local compliance with immigration detainers, thus creating sanctuary cities. That is where sanctuary cities came from, folks. State and local municipalities refusing to participate with the 287G program and the Safer Communities program that Democrats and Republicans supported and advanced to target immigrants. However, even if a local law enforcement agency had a policy of not cooperating with immigration officials, ICE could still use fingerprint records from secure communities that those local officials were basically compelled by law to give to ICE. They would then advise agency officials about where they are likely to find and arrest individuals. And I have to end this because I'm just about out of time. In 2013, under the Obama administration, secure communities resulted in record high deportations, primarily because deportations weren't targeted to a specific criteria, but encompassed anyone encountered by immigration enforcement. After secure communities was implemented, more than half of the deportations conducted by ICE under Obama were of immigrants who had never been convicted of a crime. Many immigrants, like absconders, that is literally what they call them, with minor convictions and recent border crossers, were counted as criminal aliens. To his credit, I'm going to give him credit where it's due. Obama ended the Secure Communities program in 2014, but he replaced it with broad enforcement that prioritized enforcement that was redefined by the Priority Enforcement Program. Which, okay, it was a good thing because the PEP applied guidance that redefined how DHS would address immigration enforcement, detention, and deportations, and the policy PEP narrowed enforcement priorities with a focus on targeting convicted criminals and those who threaten public safety, and limited ICE's ability to put detainer requests on those in custody who were not charged with violent crimes. But this was only after secure communities had already locked up a record number of people who hadn't committed any crime at all. And you can't tell me a constitutional scholar and professor didn't know what secure communities was going to do. So, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, listeners and viewers, I am not telling you this information because I'm doing a big ol' I told you so about what is happening. I'm not trying to make you feel bad for not paying attention to this history. What I've just spent this hour talking about is the political and ideological continuity of abusive, racist, unjust, violent, inhumane, and downright evil policy practices and the ideology behind them that devolved to greater depths of capitalist profit off of greater depravity and depraved indifference to human dignity across every US administration, Republican and Democrat. If Clinton's legislation did not pivot away from Reagan's surprisingly moderate posture on immigration, expanding criminalization of immigration for profit, or if Democrats had ever repealed that horrendous IRA legislation, or if Democrats and Republicans had not continued the bipartisan expansion of both U.S. foreign intervention and the domestic immigration gulag, Trump would not have had the framework to do what he did in his first term or what he's doing now. He certainly would have issued the executive orders that he did, but would he have been able to do as much damage as he has done now without the existing infrastructure of both legislation and racial antagonism of Americans? I don't think he would have. And that's the entire point of talking about this history and what got us to this point. Because, like I said before, and like our revolutionary ancestors have told us repeatedly, if we do not know who we are fighting, we cannot win the war we are in. So that's all my time for today. Thank you so much. A luta continua. The struggle continues. But I promise you, if we keep talking about this history and being honest about what got us here, Victoria asserta, victory is certain. Stay tuned for news, views with Garland Nixon. Peace until next time.